Did you know that the California Gold Rush, an event commemorated and celebrated across the West, was actually the catalyst for what even the government admits was a genocide? Or that under the cover of darkness, dozens of Native Americans successfully took control of Alcatraz, claiming it as rightful Indian land? Or that this beloved Chinatown, the oldest in the country, emerged at a time of exclusionary laws and violent discrimination against the Chinese community?
My name is Kahlil Greene, and I've spent thousands of hours researching and sharing creepy, crazy, and covered-up stories from American history. Stories that reveal shocking truths about how our country was formed. In 2024, I even won a Peabody Award for making a TikTok video series about the hidden history of New York City. Now, I've teamed up with National Geographic to uncover more of these stories in cities throughout America. This is Hidden History. From its earliest days, San Francisco was a magnet for innovators and trailblazers, those determined to push boundaries and drive society forward into an unknown, exciting future. But sometimes, this sense of progress and adventure came at great costs. So let's look past the Golden Gates and Tech Towers and examine 4 stories that show the city for what it really is, a place where triumph and tragedy have always gone hand in hand.
Have you ever wondered why cities like San Jose, San Diego, and San Francisco all start with the word San? Well, San is the Spanish word for saint, and these naming conventions reflect these cities' roots in the Spanish Empire and Catholicism. San Francisco specifically translates to Saint Francis, and it honors a monk from the 1200s. This monk is also honored with the Catholic mission San Francisco de Asís, one of the oldest buildings in the city, which you can actually see right behind me. In the late 1700s, European countries like England, France, Russia, and Spain were all competing to capture territories throughout the Americas. Spain specifically wanted to take control of a region known as Alta California to keep the English and the Russians out of the Pacific Northwest. Their colonial strategy was to establish these Catholic missions all throughout the region. The plan was to convert Native Americans to Christianity, make them a part of Spanish society, and use native resources and labor to solidify Spain's claim over this land. This mission specifically was established in 1776, and is just one of many that the Spanish built on the land of the Ohlone people, who are indigenous to the region that we now know as the San Francisco Bay Area. The Spanish missionaries believed that they had a moral and religious obligation to civilize Native people through the act of conversion. Sometimes, the tactics used to bring Native people to the missions were benign. They were offered gifts, food, and trading opportunities. Other times, the tactics were more sinister. Spanish soldiers threatened natives with violence and even rape if they didn't venture onto the compounds. Once there, the priests would urge the natives to get baptized as soon as possible. Baptism was used as a justification for the effective enslavement of the natives, because in the eyes of the Spanish, the act of conversion made them the legal wards of a mission. The mission controlled the lives of those it held captive. The people inside weren't able to practice the traditional ceremonies or communicate in their original languages. Long-held native customs were driven underground or abandoned and lost forever. And while some did embrace the Christian faith, many natives didn't want to stay on the missions, but physical barriers were constructed to prevent escape and keep them inside. If someone did want to leave, they would have to obtain permission, and if they escaped otherwise, soldiers were dispatched to hunt them down and bring them back to the mission for punishment. And yet, a number of the Ohlone people did manage to flee the mission. Later, some of these runaways shared their testimony, shedding an even more disturbing light on what was going on inside. One man named Tiburcio said that he had been whipped on 5 separate occasions for crying after his wife and daughter had died. Another man, Liberato, said that he had to run away after his mother, brothers, and nephews all died of hunger. And a father named Magno said that he had his rations deprived while he was taking care of his sick son. As a result, his son starved to death. To make matters worse, diseases like measles, mumps, smallpox, and influenza ran rampant throughout crowded missions. It's estimated that under Spanish rule, the native population of California halved from about 310,000 to 150,000, and 62,000 of these deaths occurred in or around these missions. But by 1833, the newly liberated country of Mexico took control of the region, secularizing the missions and freeing the enslaved native people. These former missions were auctioned, sold, or given away to military officers and ranchers. Practically homeless, many natives chose to stay on these compounds. Some found work on local ranches, and others chose to live off of the land. For its part, in 1842, Mission San Francisco de Asís only had 78 natives remaining, down from its peak of about 1,801. And in 1847, a small nearby town with a population of less than 500 was officially renamed San Francisco, just like the mission. And just a year later, a discovery in the Sierra Nevada foothills would alter the course of this young town that would soon become the iconic American city that we all know today. On January 24th, 1848, American carpenter James Marshall saw something shimmering in the American River in Sutter's Mill, California. What he saw was gold. Newspapers seized on the finding, crafting extravagant stories of a golden paradise waiting for people in the West. One story claimed that a Mormon elder named Samuel Brannan paraded around right here in Portsmouth Square with a vial of gold, yelling, "Gold! Gold from the American River!" From the bustling cities of New England to the quiet farmlands of the Midwest, Americans dropped everything, jobs, homes, families, to chase the dream of finding fortune. Now, the rush of people flooding California transformed San Francisco in an instant. The population exploded, and it went from having under 500 people to over 25,000 between 1847 and 1849. The gold rush created a surge in the demand for land, as settlers, mostly new to the region, viewed California's wealth as rightfully theirs. But the land that contained all of this wealth was a home to hundreds of diverse communities of Native Americans who had lived there for millennia. In the eyes of these miners, though, these people were just obstacles that needed to be removed. Throughout the gold rush, countless acts of brutality were committed against Native Americans by individuals, vigilante groups, and even the United States military. Despite California being a free state, the demand for labor led to slave raiding, where white people would abduct, enslave, and bring Native Americans into the gold mines to work for them. These perpetrators rarely, if ever, faced any repercussions for their actions. And the brutality did not stop there. In 1851, the first governor of California himself said that citizens should expect the extinction of the Indian race.
Shortly after, the government allocated funding to the militias that were killing Native Americans.
Just one example of the widespread state-sanctioned violence against indigenous communities. One particularly devastating example was the 1850 Bloody Island Massacre, where US soldiers attacked the innocent Pomo people in their village. Accounts of what happened paint a horrific image of indiscriminate slaughter. People tried to jump into a lake to hide, but even then, they were shot at and others drowned. One young girl hid in the bloody waters and was only able to survive by breathing air through a reed. In the Needle Rock Massacre, the Sinkyone people were completely ambushed. And in yet another massacre, a group of white men set fire to the homes of the Tolowa people. A testimony shared that the group then cut off the heads of the Native Americans and tossed them into the flames. They even threw in the Talawa babies, burning them alive. One man escaped because he covered himself in an animal skin and hid in a muddy ditch. There, he heard the murderers laughing, and when they were gone, he got up and all he saw was water full of blood and dead bodies. Because of the fires that burnt down the village, the area was then renamed to Burnt Ranch. Now, these are just a few examples from the very rare Native testimonies that we have. Who knows what other horrors occurred across dozens of other massacres? In the period around the gold rush, it's estimated that the Native population of California declined by at least 80%. It wouldn't be until 2019 that a governor of California would finally issue an apology for what happened. But even though so many Native people went through such unspeakable terror, let's be clear, they survived this genocide. Today, the Native people in California are determined to ensure that their heritage is passed on to future generations. Big-time gatherings held by communities like the Miwok and Pomo unite Native elders and youth through indigenous dances, songs, and storytelling. And among the Redwoods, the Talawa people maintain their connection to the land through the continuation of traditional basket weaving, language revitalization efforts, and sacred ceremonies like Nidash. Across the state, Native artists, educators, and leaders are reclaiming their history and contributing to the cultural fabric of California, reminding all of us that despite countless attempts at their erasure, indigenous people continue to prevail. Across the country, various cities have their own unique version of a Chinatown, but none are more famous than the original Chinatown right here in San Francisco. The origins of this neighborhood go back to the gold rush, when many Chinese people heard that there was a mountain of gold in the United States, and they chased their dreams of economic opportunity. In 1852, 20,000 Chinese immigrants came to California, and although their hard work was welcomed at first, people soon realized that gold was scant and the rumors were way overblown. Jobs became scarce and economic competition sparked outrage and resentment against the Chinese people. But out of this adversity, the close-knit Chinese community came together to form places where they could escape the bigotry, preserve their culture, and support one another as they carved out a new life in this hostile land. The Chinese miners that came to the United States in the mid-1800s to pursue gold were desperate to send money back to their family and pay off the debts that they accrued while journeying to America. But as such, they quickly earned a reputation for their hard work, perseverance, and willingness to explore lands long abandoned by white prospectors who felt such work was beneath them.
Because Chinese laborers earned significantly less than their white counterparts, the perception that Chinese labor was cheap fueled the belief that the Chinese were taking jobs and driving down wages for white workers.
And in 1852, the governor of California urged the state legislature to further check the tide of Asiatic immigration. Before long, more white Americans became swayed by racist stereotypes and fears about the growing number of Chinese immigrants. And one newspaper, the Daily Alta, called the Chinese morally worse than black people, cunning and deceitful, and unable to ever integrate into American society. Violence escalated, and mobs threw rocks at the Chinese, mockingly pulled on their hair, and subjected them to terrible verbal abuse. One elder remembered that the Chinese were treated worse than dogs. Residents often justified their bigotry under the guise of protecting labor rights. So in 1877, as further economic decline hit the US hard, a crowd of thousands, including many teenage boys, gathered to attack the Chinese population of San Francisco. One report claimed that the mob organized for days and made a list of every home that a Chinese person lived in. By the end of their rampage, it was reported that, quote, there was not a single home left which was not utterly and completely sacked. In one instance,
the laundromat that employed a 25-year-old Chinese man named Wang Go was set on fire.
And when the fire was finally put out, his dead body was found inside. But this was just one small part in a growing wave of anti-Chinese sentiment. Shortly after, a prominent organizer of the Working Men's Party in San Francisco popularized the saying, "The Chinese must go." And in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was finally signed into law,
prohibiting Chinese laborers from arriving in the US
and preventing the ones here from getting their US citizenship. Throughout this time, as Chinese people were so often attacked and excluded, those in San Francisco congregated their homes and businesses. The support systems that Chinatown offered made it a necessary enclave for the Chinese community. For example, benevolent societies helped newly arrived immigrants settle, and they built important cultural resources like temples. Soon, this area grew to encompass over 10 city blocks and was known as Little Canton, the Chinese Quarter, and finally, Chinatown. By 1880, 30% of Chinese immigrants to California lived in San Francisco. Many of them started their own businesses like laundromats and restaurants. It wouldn't be until after the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1880s that the fear of economic competition with the Chinese was mitigated, and other San Franciscans began to accept them. This town grew to cater not only to the Chinese community, but to all San Franciscans and to visitors from around the world. And stemming from this very first Chinatown, scores of others sprang up across the country, becoming an iconic symbol of cultural heritage nationwide. Sitting just 1 mile off of the San Francisco shore, the island of Alcatraz, right behind me, is most infamous for being a remote fortress built to imprison the world's most dangerous and rebellious inmates like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and the Birdman Robert Stroud. The island came under the control of the United States in 1850, and shortly after, the Army built a military prison there. In one notable instance, 19 Hopi Native American men were imprisoned on Alcatraz for resisting government-run boarding schools where they would be indoctrinated, assimilated, and forced to forget their culture, beliefs, and ways of life. For decades after, Alcatraz remained an isolated, nearly inescapable prison, but things started to change in the 1960s. The government questioned whether running such an expensive, high-security facility was worth the cost. And at around the same time, a movement was sweeping the nation of Native American activists fighting to protect their civil rights, echoing that same spirit of those Hopi prisoners years before. The seeds of indigenous activism on Alcatraz were sown in 1964, when a group of Lakota activists briefly occupied the island. They invoked a provision in an 1868 treaty that allowed the Lakota people to reclaim unused federal lands, and they offered to purchase Alcatraz for a nominal fee. But under the threat of arrest, this occupation only lasted a few hours, but it did lay the groundwork for future action on the island. That came in 1969, when a Mohawk activist, Richard Oakes, led a new group of indigenous activists to build on the 1964 occupation. Learning from the previous group's attempt, they aimed for a pan-indigenous approach and formed a group called the Indians of All Tribes to focus on unity instead of one single tribe's claim. And in a proclamation made to the Great White Father, they invoked the right of discovery and laid out their plans to build a Native American school, an American Indian museum, and a spiritual center on the island. And most importantly, this new group planned for a much longer-term occupation, understanding that generating media awareness would be crucial to exerting pressure on the government. On November 20th, 1969, approximately 100 Native Americans took boats to Alcatraz Island and set up an occupation there. They established themselves into a community. They elected a council and divided jobs amongst themselves, like schooling, sanitation, and security. All decisions were made by unanimous consent of the people, allowing them to solely focus on achieving their goals. After the occupation started, internal conflict emerged when newly arrived protesters brought different priorities and set up divisions and disputes over leadership. And the strategic response of the government further hampered the occupation as they cut off utilities, imposed a blockade, and refused meaningful negotiations. On top of this, they tried to use the media to paint the activists' demands as unreasonable. The occupation gradually began to dwindle, and by June 1971, only 15 protesters remained. At this time, U.S. Marshals came to remove the remaining occupiers, officially ending the occupation after 19 months. The 1969 to 1971 occupation coincided with a number of other victories for native land rights. For example, during the occupation, President Nixon returned Blue Lake and 48,000 acres of land to the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico. And it also paved the way for the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which promoted tribal sovereignty. The Alcatraz occupation now is remembered as a turning point for indigenous activism during the 20th century because it forced the American public and the federal government to acknowledge Native demands, and it served as a blueprint for future protests. And on Thanksgiving morning every year, people from around the country journey to the island to celebrate the indigenous people's sunrise gathering, or Unthanksgiving, to commemorate the occupation and celebrate their culture. So although those young activists did not achieve all of their original goals, the national attention they garnered contributed to massive changes in U.S. policy and ushered in a new era of indigenous activism. In San Francisco, you'll find self-driving cars and leaders advancing artificial intelligence. However, these all exist in a city rooted in the contributions of overlooked people who paved the way for these innovations to flourish in the first place. The legacy of the Native Americans who survived the cruelty of the California Genocide is widely evident, from the practices that preserve rivers and valleys to the revival of traditions once thought to be lost. And what began as a refuge for Chinese immigrants fleeing violence is now a bustling hub of the city, drawing in millions of visitors and enriching the cultural fabric of this country. And that occupation on Alcatraz, that act of defiance by those young Native activists forever changed the conversation around indigenous rights. And today, movements for land reclamation and equality continue to build on their bold action. The early history of San Francisco teaches us that real progress is not about chasing the next gold rush or big tech breakthrough. It's about reconciling our past, addressing historical wrongs, and ensuring that every community has the space to honor their heritage and shape the future. Is there another hidden story that you want us to explore, or a city that you think we should visit next? If so, drop a suggestion in the comments. We're always looking for new ideas and we'll do our best to make them happen. Until then, see you in the next city.